Richard Speck. In the summer of 1966, 8 young student nurses lost their lives in a single night in Chicago, in a crime so shocking that it would grip the entire nation for years afterward. The man responsible was Richard Speck, a drifter with a long criminal record and a crude, now infamous tattoo inked across his forearm that read, "Born to Raise Hell." That tattoo would become his undoing, thanks to the one woman who lived to tell investigators what she had seen. Speck broke into a townhouse that served as a residence for student nurses on the night of July 13th, quietly binding the young women he found inside, one by one. Over the course of several long hours, he killed 8 of them. What he failed to realize, in his heavily impaired and disoriented state, was that the home had actually held 9 young women that night. How did a single survivor end up changing everything? The 9th woman was Corazon Amurao, a young exchange nurse from the Philippines. As the horror slowly unfolded in the rooms around her, Amurao rolled beneath a bed and pressed herself tight against the wall, staying perfectly silent and perfectly still for hours on end. Speck, who had been drinking heavily that night, simply lost count of his victims and never discovered her hiding place. She remained there in the dark until the early morning, long after he had finally gone. When she at last emerged from her hiding place, she climbed out onto a window ledge and screamed desperately for help. And when the police finally arrived at the scene, she became, in an instant, the single most important witness that the city had ever seen. She gave detectives a careful description for a sketch, and one detail in particular leapt out at them above all the rest, the unusual tattoo she had seen on the killer's arm. Why did that one detail matter so much? Because it handed the manhunt a precise and genuinely uncommon marker to chase, something far more specific than height or hair color. Speck, meanwhile, had injured himself and been taken to a county hospital for emergency treatment. There, a doctor recognized the distinctive "Born to Raise Hell" tattoo from the description that was circulating in the news, and he immediately picked up the phone and called the police. The man hunted by an entire terrified city had been lying quietly in a hospital bed the whole time, but the case against him would still rest on the woman who survived him. At his trial, in a single moment that stunned the entire packed courtroom into silence, Amurao rose up from the witness stand, walked slowly and deliberately across the floor to the very spot where Speck was seated, raised her hand without any hesitation, and pointed directly at him. She identified him simply as, "This is the man," and in doing so left no room whatsoever for doubt in the minds of the jury. Could he escape justice after that? He could not. The jury convicted Speck of all 8 murders after deliberating, and he was sentenced to die in the electric chair. When the death penalty was struck down across the country a few years later, his sentence was converted instead to a term of several hundred years, and he was then repeatedly denied parole every single time he came up for it, 7 times in all. He spent the entire rest of his life behind bars, died of a heart attack in prison in 1991, just one day before what would have been his 50th birthday. There is a small but haunting footnote to the whole case. A drifter had reportedly recognized Speck from the published sketch and even tried to alert the police himself. But for whatever reason, that particular tip was never properly acted upon at the time. In the end, it was not luck, and it was not a stray phone call that brought Richard Speck to justice. It was the quiet courage and the clear, unshakable memory of the one young woman who had hidden beneath a bed and lived to face him. Amurao survived by staying hidden and holding on to a single, telling detail. The next survivor would do almost the opposite, deliberately memorizing every fact she could during more than a day in a killer's hands. determined that if she made it out alive, she alone would be the one to bring him down. Bobby Joe Long. In 1984, the Tampa Bay area of Florida was being terrorized by a killer who would take the lives of at least 10 women in a matter of months. His name was Bobby Joe Long, and before he turned to murder, he had already attacked dozens of other women across the region over a period of years. He seemed careful, methodical, and very nearly impossible to catch. Then he made one fatal mistake. He let a single person go. That person was a teenager named Lisa McVeigh, and her composure under unimaginable pressure would prove to be his downfall. Long abducted McVeigh late one night as she rode her bicycle home from work and held her captive against her will for more than a day. What he did not understand was that, even in the middle of her ordeal, she was working. She had decided that if there was any chance she might survive, she was going to remember everything she possibly could and hand it all to the police. How does someone think that clearly while fearing for their life? McVeigh was extraordinary. She quietly memorized the twists and turns of the route the car took and the various sounds she heard along the way. She noted a word she glimpsed on the dashboard and the details of a stop the car made at a bank machine. At one point, she deliberately touched surfaces in his bathroom so that she would leave behind her fingerprints, physical proof that she had been there. She was quietly building a case against her captor from the inside. Then she did something even harder than all of that. She talked to him, and slowly, carefully persuaded him to release her rather than kill her. When Long finally let her go, McVeigh walked straight to the authorities and delivered an account so detailed it stunned investigators. The stop at the bank machine was the key that unlocked everything. Police cross-referenced the time of that transaction with the owners of a particular model of car, the one whose name McVeigh had read on the dashboard, and the trail led them directly to Bobby Joe Long. Could they tie him to the killings as well? They could. Once Long was identified and brought in, physical evidence began to connect him to the murders that had haunted the region for months, including distinctive red carpet fibers that matched those found with several of the victims. The man who had seemed uncatchable for months had been undone in a matter of days, all because he had underestimated the teenager he chose to spare. Long was arrested in November of 1984, only a couple of weeks after he had released McVeigh back into the world. He eventually pleaded guilty to a long list of murders and was handed multiple life sentences along with a sentence of death for one of the killings. For decades afterward, he sat on Florida's death row while his appeals slowly ran their course. What became of the young woman who caught him? Lisa McVeigh did something remarkable with the life she had fought so hard to keep. She grew up to become a sworn sheriff's deputy, working in law enforcement in the very region that Long had once terrorized, turning her own survival into a long career spent protecting other people. Her story has since been told and retold as one of the most striking examples of a victim turning the tables on a serial killer. In 2019, Bobby Joe Long was executed by the state of Florida. McVeigh was there to witness it, seated in the very front row alongside another woman who had also survived him. The teenager he had let walk away, certain she could do him no harm, sat and watched as the law finally closed his story for good. For investigators, the lesson was hard to miss. A killer who had outsmarted the police for the better part of a year was brought down in the end, not by a crime lab or a lucky break, but by the sheer presence of mind of a young person he had carelessly dismissed as harmless. McVeigh's careful memory put a serial killer behind bars and kept him there. The next case turned on an act of courage from someone even more vulnerable, a survivor who could not speak a single word, yet still found a way to point investigators straight toward the man who had hurt her. Tommy Lynn Sells. Tommy Lynn Sells was one of the most chilling killers in American history. A drifter who rode trains and hitchhiked across the country for years, leaving victims in his wake. He claimed a truly staggering number of killings over the years, and investigators were able to tie him firmly to a great many of them. For a long time, he moved like a ghost, striking in one place and then vanishing to the next. What finally stopped him was the courage of a child who refused to die. On the last night of 1999, Sells broke into a home near Del Rio, Texas, and attacked two young girls who were there. One of them did not survive. The other, gravely hurt and left for dead, was about to do something almost unimaginable. How does someone so badly wounded find the strength to act? The surviving girl, Crystal Surles, had the presence of mind to stay completely still and play dead until she was certain Sells had gone. Then, despite a grave injury that had robbed her of her voice, she rose and made her way out of the house, walking a long and lonely stretch through the dark to reach the nearest neighbor's home and find help. She could not call out for anyone. She could not even speak a word. So how did she tell anyone what had happened? She wrote it down. Unable to make a single sound, Surles communicated with the neighbor entirely in writing, scratching out a desperate plea for help to be sent and a heartbreaking question that has haunted nearly everyone who has heard it since, asking simply whether or not she was going to live. The neighbor, a retiree, called for emergency help in the small hours of the morning and then stayed close by her side, comforting her and quietly praying she would hold on until help could arrive. She did hold on, and once she was safe, she became the most important witness investigators could have hoped for. Surles gave authorities a clear and detailed description of her attacker, enough for a forensic artist to produce a sketch. That sketch was the breakthrough the case had been missing. Within days, the drifter who had slipped across state lines for years was identified as Tommy Lynn Sells, and he was arrested at the start of the new year. Could she face him again to make it count? She could, and she did. At his trial, Surles took the stand and identified Sells as the man who had attacked her, her testimony carrying the weight of someone who had survived the unthinkable. It was her account of that night, more than any single piece of forensic evidence, that ultimately sealed his fate in the courtroom. There is a detail that makes the case even more sobering. Years earlier, another survivor had actually fought Sells off during an attack, striking him and wounding him badly enough to send him to a hospital. That woman had escaped, and he had served time. But at the time, no one realized they were dealing with a serial killer, and he was eventually released to continue his travels. Her bravery had saved her own life, but the system had not yet connected the dots. It was the young survivor in Texas who finally revealed him for what he truly was. Sells was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. For more than a decade, he remained on death row, his name attached to a long trail of cases across the country that investigators continue to examine. In 2014, Tommy Lynn Sells was executed by the state of Texas. Crystal Surles, the child who had once played dead, walked through the dark and written out her own cry for help, was there as the sentence was carried out, having grown into a woman who had spent years carrying the memory of the night she survived. For investigators, the case stood as proof that the smallest and most vulnerable witness can topple even the most elusive of killers. A man who had crossed the entire country undetected was finally undone by a child who had been robbed of her voice and yet refused, with everything she had, to lose her life. Surly's gave investigators the face that ended Sells's long travels. The next survivor gave them something else entirely. A license plate and a description recalled from one of the most desperate escapes anyone could imagine. William Reese. In the summer of 1997, a recently paroled man named William Reese moved to the Houston area, and over just a few months, took the lives of 4 young victims across Texas and Oklahoma. He is the only person ever convicted of more than one killing, connected to the notorious and desolate stretch of Texas land that became widely known as the Killing Fields. For years afterward, his crimes went unsolved, and the answer to who he really was would come, at least in part, from a single woman who somehow managed to get away. Her name was Sandra Sapah, and her escape was as desperate as any in these cases. Reese abducted Sapah at knife point after deliberately disabling her vehicle, forcing her into his truck. Believing without a doubt that he intended to kill her, she made a split-second decision that took an almost unimaginable amount of nerve. While the truck was still moving down the interstate at speed, she threw herself bodily from it, hitting the pavement hard and suffering serious injuries. But she had survived, and in that instant, she was free. How do you identify a man when you escaped in sheer panic? At first, many of the details were hazy, buried under the sheer trauma of what she had just been through. But working patiently with investigators over time, Sapah was eventually able to recall a number of key details, including the killer's license plate, and she picked him out from a set of photographs. Her account proved strong enough to convict Reese of aggravated kidnapping, sending him to prison for a lengthy term and taking him off the streets. But here the story becomes more complicated than the simple idea of a survivor catching a killer. Because while Sapah's bravery had stopped Reese in his tracks and put him behind bars, the 4 killings he had committed during that single summer remained officially unsolved for many years afterward. He simply sat in prison as a convicted kidnapper, rather than as the murderer that investigators had quietly suspected him of being all along. The evidence that would finally tie him to those deaths had not yet caught up with him. So what finally closed the murders? The answer was DNA. Nearly 2 decades after the crimes, genetic evidence connected Reese to one of the victims, and once he was finally confronted with it, he confessed to the crimes and even led investigators to where some of the victims had been left. The science, and not the survivor, was what ultimately solved the killings themselves, even though it was the survivor who had identified and imprisoned the man in the first place. The two of them together, the survivor and the science, finally completed the picture. What happened to him in the end? Reese would face justice across 2 states. He was convicted of one of the murders and sentenced to death in Oklahoma, and he later pleaded guilty to the 3 killings in Texas, receiving life sentences for them. Sandra Sapah, the woman who had thrown herself from a moving truck in order to escape him, returned to a courtroom many years later to testify against him once again, calmly facing down the man she had been forced to flee all those years before. As of recent years, Reese remains alive and incarcerated, with his appeals still slowly working their way through the court system. His death sentence has been challenged and then upheld through several rounds, and he was eventually moved back to Oklahoma to await the carrying out of that sentence, with the state expected to seek a firm execution date once his final appeals have been exhausted. Reese's case is a reminder that the line between a survivor catching a killer and science catching a killer is not always clean. A woman's raw courage took him off the road and locked him away, and only years later did the evidence finally name him for the far worse crimes he had hidden. Without her desperate escape from that truck, He might very well never have become a suspect in any of it at all. Sapaw's leap from a moving truck put Reese in prison, even if it took DNA to tie him at last to the killings. The next case is harder still to tell, because its survivors spoke up again and again over many years, and for a long, painful time, almost no one would listen to a word they said. Samuel Little. Samuel Little is, according to the FBI, the most prolific serial killer in the history of the United States. Over the span of several decades, he eventually confessed to dozens upon dozens of killings spread across many different states, and investigators have since confirmed a large share of those confessions. For most of those long years, he moved through the country almost completely unnoticed. The reason why is the most disturbing part of his entire story, and it is the reason this case belongs here, even though it does not fit neatly. Because Samuel Little's survivors did try to catch him. They tried for years, and for a long, shameful time, no one in a position of power would believe them. Little deliberately targeted women on the margins of society, people he believed the world would not look for or miss. It was a calculated choice. He understood that if his victims were poor or struggling or living lives that society had already turned away from, then their disappearances would draw little attention and their accounts would carry little weight. So what happened when survivors came forward? In one instance back in the early 1980s, Little was actually caught in the very act of attacking a woman, and in the aftermath, several survivors came forward to report what he had done to them as well. Their reports, however, were repeatedly dismissed, in large part because of who those women were. Some of them had personal histories that made the authorities doubt their word, and instead of being treated as the credible witnesses to a dangerous predator that they were quietly brushed aside. Little served only minor sentences and walked free again and again, each time returning to the very behavior the survivors had so clearly described. How does someone like that finally get stopped? Not in the end by being believed. It took cold, impartial science. In 2012, Little was arrested on an unrelated charge and his DNA was taken, and that single sample connected him to several unsolved killings from years earlier. He had been picked up at a homeless shelter on an old, unrelated warrant, never once imagining that a simple swab of his cheek would finally begin to unravel everything the survivors had been saying for decades. Once the DNA matched, the case against him grew quickly. He was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to spend the entire rest of his natural life in prison, with no possibility of release. And at his trial, the survivors who had once been ignored finally had their day, taking the stand to testify against the man who had hurt them, this time with the full and undeniable weight of the evidence behind their words. Could he be linked to even more? He could, and what followed was staggering. Once he was safely behind bars for good, a determined Texas investigator spent hundreds of hours patiently interviewing Little, who slowly began to confess to killing after killing, eventually admitting to dozens upon dozens of murders stretching all the way back across the decades. He even sat and drew detailed portraits of some of his victims from memory, haunting images that authorities later used in an effort to identify the women by name and bring long-awaited answers to suffering families. Samuel Little died in custody in late 2020, taking at least some of his secrets to the grave with him, though investigators are still quietly working to match his many confessions to unsolved cases around the country to this very day. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. Little's survivors were proven right at last, but only after science finally forced the issue and made the truth impossible to ignore. The next case is one where the popular story does not quite hold up, because the killer who once terrorized an entire region was not, in the end, stopped by any single victim at all. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez, the killer the press called the Night Stalker, terrorized Southern California and the San Francisco Bay Area for more than a year in the mid-1980s. He crept into homes after dark, attacking people in their own beds without warning. And he left an entire region sleeping uneasily with its windows locked and its lights left burning through the night. His case is one of the most famous in American crime. And it is also one where the popular idea of a survivor catching the killer simply does not hold. That is worth being honest about, because several people did survive Ramirez, and their courage mattered enormously. Survivors gave investigators a number of crucial descriptions, including the memorable detail of his badly decayed teeth, all of which helped build a working picture of the man that police were hunting. One woman lived through being shot at point-blank range and was able to describe him afterward. Yet for all of their remarkable bravery, it was not any single victim of his who finally brought him down. The real breakthrough in the case came from somewhere else entirely. So what actually cracked the case? It began with a teenager. Late one August night, after Ramirez tried and failed to break into a home, a teenage boy spotted the stranger and memorized the make, color, and partial plate of the car he drove away in. He immediately told the police, and that single sharp-eyed observation set absolutely everything in motion. The car was found abandoned some days later, and although Ramirez had carefully tried to wipe it clean of any trace, investigators managed to lift one usable fingerprint from the rearview mirror. Why did one fingerprint matter so much? Because of a stroke of timing that bordered on the genuinely unbelievable. California had only just installed a brand new computerized fingerprint system, and that system happened to contain the prints of criminals who had been born after the first day of 1960. Ramirez had been born just 2 months after that cutoff, which meant his print was in the system at all, only by the narrowest of margins. The match came back with a name attached, and officials would later call it something very close to a miracle. With a name and a face finally in hand, the police made a fateful and risky decision. They released his photograph to the public, plastering it across newspapers and television screens all over the state. The man who had moved unseen through the dark for over a year suddenly had nowhere left to hide. How did it finally end? Not in a courtroom, and not at the hands of a victim, but in the street. The morning after his photo ran everywhere, Ramirez wandered into a store and saw his own face staring straight back at him from the front pages of the newspapers. He turned and fled, but he was quickly recognized by ordinary people on the streets of the East Los Angeles neighborhood. A crowd of residents chased him down and held him, restraining the man who had terrified them all for so long until the police arrived to take him into custody. It was a group of ordinary people, and not any single survivor of his, who physically stopped him in the end. Ramirez was put on trial and, in 1989, convicted of more than a dozen murders along with a long list of other crimes. He was sentenced to death and sent to await his execution. Throughout the entire ordeal, he showed not a single flicker of remorse, openly playing up his fascination with evil for the cameras and treating the whole proceeding as if it were a stage built just for him. He never met that fate at the hands of the state. In 2013, Ramirez died of cancer while he was still sitting on death row, nearly 3 decades after his capture, having spent the entire rest of his life locked behind bars. In the end, the teenager's sharp eyes, an almost impossibly lucky fingerprint, and a furious crowd of neighbors had done what no single victim of his ever could. Ramirez was stopped by a witness, a fingerprint, and a neighborhood that refused to let him slip away. The next case swings back to the cleaner version of this story, A killer brought down squarely by the testimony of the one woman who lived through an attack that took her co-worker's life. If you have made it this far and you are enjoying these cases, take a second to like and subscribe so you do not miss the survivors still to come. Randall Woodfield. Randall Woodfield had once seemed destined for a very different life. A standout college football player, he was drafted by the Green Bay Packers in the 1970s before his career collapsed amid a string of arrests. Within just a few short years, though, he had become one of the most feared killers in the entire Pacific Northwest, known as the I-5 Killer for the interstate highway along which he hunted. He was eventually convicted of only a single murder, yet investigators have linked him to many more. And the reason he was caught at all comes down to a single woman who lived. Her name was Beth Wilmot, and her testimony became the cornerstone of the entire case. On a January night in 1981, Woodfield entered an office building in Kaiser, Oregon, where two young women, both 20 years old, were working as cleaners. He attacked the pair and shot them both, leaving them for dead. One of the women, Sherry Hull, did not survive. The other, Beth Wilmot, suffered a grievous wound to the head, but against all odds, survived and lived through the night. How does someone survive something like that and still help catch the man responsible? Through sheer determination. Despite the trauma and the severity of her injury, Wilmot was able to give detectives a description of the attacker. And when she was later shown a photo lineup, she identified Woodfield as the man who had shot her and killed her co-worker. For a killer who had moved freely across state lines under different nicknames and disguises, leaving police in separate jurisdictions completely unaware that they were all chasing the very same man, a living eyewitness was the one thing in the world he could not outrun. Why had he been so hard to catch in the first place? Because his crimes were spread out across Oregon, Washington, and California, and he changed both his methods and his appearance often, at times wearing a fake beard to disguise his real face from his victims. Different police departments were investigating what looked like separate crimes, never realizing the attacks belonged to a single man. Wilmot's identification finally gave them a name to attach to the pattern, and once they had it, the other pieces began to fall into place. What sealed the case against him? After Woodfield was arrested in March of 1981, investigators built a wall of corroborating evidence around Wilmot's account. There was ballistics evidence tying him directly to the shootings, the same distinctive brand of tape that had been used in his crimes, and even detailed phone records that traced his restless movements up and down the length of the interstate. But it was Wilmot who took the stand as the key witness for the prosecution, calmly facing the man who had tried to kill her and telling the jury exactly what he had done. The jury believed every word she said. Woodfield was convicted of the murder of Sherry Hull and the attempted murder of Beth Wilmot, along with several other charges, and he was sentenced to life in prison plus 90 years, with still more time added in a later trial. The former athlete who had once been bound for a professional stage would instead spend the rest of his days behind bars. Is the story truly finished? Not entirely, and this is where it grows even darker. Although Woodfield was formally convicted of just the one murder, advances in DNA technology have since linked him to several additional killings from that same brutal period, slowly confirming what investigators had long suspected about the true and terrible scope of his crimes. Estimates of how many lives he may truly have taken run far, far higher than the single case that finally put him away. He has never confessed to any of it. To this very day, Woodfield remains alive and incarcerated in an Oregon prison, one of only a small handful of the killers in this collection still living, quietly serving out a sentence that ensures he will never once walk free again. The very woman he had left for dead had made certain of that. Wilmot's testimony was the single thread that unraveled a killer who had hidden behind disguises and state lines. The next case is one where the survivors lived to tell their stories, and yet none of them could ever be the one to finally stop the man who had taken so much from them. Christopher Wilder. Christopher Wilder was a wealthy and charming Australian-born businessman who used the false promise of modeling work to lure young women toward him. In the spring of 1984, he carried out one of the most frenzied and far-ranging cross-country killing sprees in all of American history, moving restlessly from state to state over the course of roughly 6 weeks. Several of the people he abducted during that time lived to tell what had happened to them, and their accounts are a large part of why we know the full story at all today. Yet this is another case where the popular framing breaks down, because Wilder was never truly caught by a victim. To understand why that is, you have to follow the spree all the way to its strange and violent end. Wilder approached his victims with a smooth and practiced pitch, presenting himself as a professional photographer or a talent scout and offering them what looked like a real chance at glamour and modeling work. Over those few weeks, he abducted a string of young women, killing many of them as he drove a path across the country. The entire nation was soon gripped by the manhunt, and his face was placed squarely on the FBI's most wanted list as federal agents scrambled to track his rapid movements across state lines. So who survived him, and how? At least a few captives lived through their encounters with Wilder. One young woman he abducted was kept alive for a time and even forced to travel with him before he eventually let her go at an airport, allowing her to make her way home. Another captive was left badly hurt in a remote, wooded area, but somehow managed to survive and reach help. An earlier victim had also escaped his grasp before the spree fully ignited. The testimony of these survivors would later prove absolutely vital to piecing together exactly what he had done and where. But here is the crucial difference from the other cases. None of these survivors were the ones who stopped Wilder. They had escaped him, which is its own profound kind of triumph. But they did not bring about his actual capture. By the time his spree neared its end, he was already a hunted man with nowhere left to run, and the only real question left was no longer whether he would be caught, but exactly how it would happen. How did it finally end? Not with an arrest, and not with a survivor's confrontation. In April of 1984, near the Canadian border in New Hampshire, state troopers recognized Wilder and approached him. A violent struggle broke out, and during it, Wilder was shot and died at the scene, with the very same gunfire also wounding one of the troopers in the process. The man who had terrorized the entire country for 6 long weeks was gone in a single instant, never to stand trial, never to answer for even one of his many crimes in a courtroom, and never to provide the answers his victims' families so desperately wanted. That ending is exactly why his case sits awkwardly in any list of killers caught by their survivors. The women who lived through Wilder did something extraordinary simply by surviving, and their voices have carried the truth of what he did across the decades. In recent years, some of them have chosen to speak publicly for the very first time in decades, ensuring that the victims are properly remembered and that the full horror of those 6 weeks is never quietly forgotten. But they remain the narrators of this story and never its captors. It is an important distinction to draw, because it would be easy and very tempting to simply fold Wilder into the neat and satisfying idea of a victim turning the tables on her attacker. The reality is more sobering. His survivors escaped with their lives, and that fact alone is remarkable. But the man himself slipped beyond the reach of any justice in a sudden roadside struggle, dying before any court or any victim could ever hold him to account for everything he had done. Wilder's survivors carried his story forward, even though none of them could be the one to end his spree. The final case returns to firmer ground, to two roommates whose courage and quick thinking on a single terrifying morning finally brought down a killer that the police had never once managed to stop. Albert DeSalvo. Few crime stories are as famous or as tangled as that of the Boston Strangler. Between 1962 and 1964, 13 women were attacked and strangled in their homes across the Boston area, spreading fear through the city. A man named Albert DeSalvo would eventually confess to all of the killings, and his name became forever linked to the case in the public imagination. Yet the way he was actually identified, and the role survivors played in it, is far more complicated than the legend suggests. This is a case that only partly fits the idea of a survivor catching a killer. Here is the key fact that often gets lost. DeSalvo was not first caught for the stranglings at all. He was identified through an entirely separate series of crimes, a string of assaults committed by a man the press had nicknamed the Green Man. In late 1964, a woman survived an attack and gave police a detailed description of her assailant, and that description led them straight to Albert DeSalvo. So, a survivor did identify him. But of which crimes? This is where the story turns. When DeSalvo's photograph was published in connection with the Green Man assaults, many other women came forward to identify him as the man who had attacked them. Their accounts were ultimately what put him in custody. But these were the survivors of the assaults, and not of the stranglings. It was only later, while he was being held, that DeSalvo confessed in detail to being the Boston Strangler. Did the survivors of the stranglings identify him too? Strikingly, no. And this is the detail that complicates the legend most of all. The one woman known to have survived an attack that was attributed to the Strangler was shown DeSalvo at one point and did not identify him as her attacker at all. That single, stubborn fact has fueled decades of serious doubt about whether DeSalvo truly committed all of the killings he confessed to, or whether more than one man was responsible for the crimes that were attributed to a single phantom figure. DeSalvo's confession itself was something of a puzzle. He recounted certain details that genuinely impressed the investigators, yet his account also contained real inconsistencies, and many people who knew him personally struggled to believe he was capable of the murders at all. Crucially, he was never actually charged with any of the stranglings. Instead, he was convicted of the unrelated assaults and sentenced to life in prison, where, in 1973, he was found dead, killed in prison by an unknown hand. So was the mystery ever truly solved? For one of the victims, the answer finally came decades later, and it came from science rather than any survivor. In 2013, investigators used DNA to re-examine the case of the final victim, 19-year-old Mary Sullivan. Testing tied DeSalvo conclusively to her killing, first through a sample from one of his relatives, and then by exhuming his remains for a direct comparison. Officials announced that they finally had an unprecedented level of certainty that DeSalvo had been the one who killed Sullivan. But that match settled only one case out of many. For the other women whose deaths were attributed to the Strangler, the DNA proved nothing one way or the other, and the debate over them continues to this day. Some researchers remain firmly convinced that several different killers were at work during those years, and that the tidy story of one lone man behind every single death may never have been the whole truth. DeSalvo's confession and the DNA tie him firmly to one murder, but the rest remain, in the strictest sense, unproven. That is why his case belongs here only with an asterisk. A survivor's description did identify Albert DeSalvo and helped put him behind bars, and that was certainly no small thing. But the survivor of a strangling did not point to him, and it was DNA, not a living witness, that finally proved his guilt in the one case it could. The legend and the evidence, it turns out, do not line up as neatly as the famous name would suggest. DeSalvo was caught by a survivor of one set of crimes, even as the survivor of another could not place him at the scene. The final case leaves no such doubt, returning at last to two women whose desperate escape ended a killer's reign beyond any question at all. Coral Eugene Watts. Carl Eugene Watts, known by the nickname Coral and remembered as the Sunday morning slasher, may well have been one of the most prolific killers this country has ever produced, with his possible victims numbering well into the dozens. He was also one of the hardest to catch, precisely because his crimes made so little sense. Unlike most killers of his kind, his attacks were not driven by any sexual motive. He simply targeted women who were complete strangers to him, struck with terrible and sudden speed, and then left almost nothing at all behind for investigators to follow up on. For years, that very pattern made him a kind of ghost. And then, two young women refused to become his next victims. In May of 1982, in Houston, Texas, Watts followed a 21-year-old woman named Lori Lister home. He attacked her outside her apartment and dragged her toward the unit she shared with her roommate, an 18-year-old named Melinda Aguilar. What Watts did not count on was that Aguilar would keep her wits about her in the face of pure terror. How do you survive a moment like that? Aguilar made a split-second choice to play dead, letting her body go completely limp as he bound her hands behind her, all the while watching and waiting for any small chance to act. When Watts turned his attention back to Lister and moved to drown her in the bathtub, Aguilar seized her opportunity and leapt from a second-story balcony, her hands still tied, screaming for help. Her cries quickly brought neighbors running. They held Watts there until the police arrived, and one of them pulled Lister from the water just in time to save her life. Both women survived. It cannot be said often enough that this was not, in any sense, a triumph of detective work. It was the raw courage and quick thinking of two young women that finally ended the career of a killer the police had been unable to stop. But what came next outraged the public for years. Because his individual killings had left so little evidence, prosecutors made a controversial bargain. In exchange for confessions, they offered Watts immunity from murder charges, and he pleaded guilty instead to a burglary charge connected to the attack on the two roommates, receiving a 60-year sentence. He went on to lead investigators to the hidden burial sites of several victims, grimly confirming the staggering scale of what he had truly done. And yet, he had already been promised that he could never once be tried for those murders. Could a deal like that really set him free? It nearly did. A loophole involving credit for good behavior eventually made Watts eligible for release as the years quietly passed. And the very prospect of a confessed serial killer simply walking out of a prison sparked a furious public outcry. Prosecutors in another state then raced against the clock to keep him locked away for good. They found a way. Reaching back into older, unsolved cases, Michigan prosecutors charged and ultimately convicted Watts of two separate murders from years earlier, one of them resting largely on the testimony of a man who had witnessed an attack through his window long ago and never forgotten the killer's cold eyes. Those two convictions brought sentences of life without parole, slamming shut the door that the original plea deal had nearly left wide open. He would never be released after all. Watts died of cancer in 2007, while he was still serving out those two Michigan sentences. taking the full and final count of his victims to the grave, along with him. To this very day, no one knows for certain exactly how many women he killed across those years, and a great many of his suspected cases remain officially unsolved. What remains beyond any doubt is how he was finally stopped, not by the law, which had watched him slip away again and again, and not by the evidence, which he had been careful never to leave. He was stopped instead by a young woman who played dead, freed herself, and then jumped from a balcony with her hands still bound in order to scream for help, and by the roommate who survived the morning alongside her. Two young women had done what an entire system could not, and in doing so they almost certainly saved the lives of every woman who would otherwise have come after them. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.